So, let's talk about Abraham. I mean, what a colossal figure, right? His name just echoes through millennia. He's revered as the patriarch of not one, not two, but three of the world's major religions.
I mean, just let that sink in for a second. We're talking more than 3 billion people. Over half the population of the entire planet, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, they all trace their spiritual lineage back to this one guy. His story isn't just important, it's a cornerstone of global faith.
But, and this is the big but, was he even a real person? I mean, for someone that influential, you'd expect some kind of historical trail, right? Well, it goes completely cold. There are 0 independent sources outside the Bible that confirm he ever lived. So that's the big question we're tackling. Was Abraham a man of history, a figure of collective memory, or a foundational myth?
Okay, let's treat this like we're detectives on a historical cold case. To get to the bottom of this, we need to sift through all the clues, starting with the bits of evidence that seem to suggest there really is a real person at the heart of this whole story.
Okay, so this is where the case gets really interesting. It's full of tension. Because on the one hand, you've got these clues that seem to fit perfectly. The names in the story, Abram, Sarai, yeah, those are totally the right kind of names for the early 2nd millennium BCE. And the whole story of a semi-nomadic family migrating, that lines up with what we know about how people moved around back then. But then, there's the other hand, a total, deafening silence in the historical record. No inscriptions, no tablets, not a single archaeological trace of his altars or where he might have settled. It's nothing.
So, just when you think you're starting to build a case, bam, a major plot twist. We start finding these key details in the story that don't just lack evidence, they actually seem to contradict the historical and archaeological timeline.
And this timeline really just lays out the problem perfectly. Abraham is traditionally placed way back, around 2000 BCE. But the Philistines, a group he supposedly interacts with, they don't even show up in the area for another 800 years. Domesticated camels as pack animals? That's almost 1,000 years later. And the Chaldeans? More than a millennium away. The timelines are just completely, totally out of sync.
And look, we have to be clear here. These aren't just tiny, nitpicky details. No, these are fundamental to the story. The camels, there's wealth, his transportation. The Philistines, he's making deals with these guys, they're major political players in his life. And the Chaldeans, that's literally where he's from. All 3 of these things are what historians call anachronisms, a fancy word for details that are just completely out of their proper time period.
So what does this all mean? Well, most scholars look at this and conclude that these anachronisms tell us way more about when the story was written down than when it supposedly happened. The thinking is that later authors and editors, writing hundreds and hundreds of years after the fact, were shaping these older traditions and, projecting their own world back into the distant past. You can imagine, this wild mix of tantalizing clues and huge glaring contradictions has sparked a really fascinating debate among scholars. So let's take a look at how the experts tried to solve this puzzle.
Essentially, all this conflicting evidence has basically split scholars into 3 main camps. You've got the minimalists. They look at the anachronisms and the lack of hard evidence and say, nope, this story is a literary creation from a much later time. To them, Abraham is a powerful symbol, not a real person. Then all the way on the other side, you have the maximalists. They argue that, hey, there is a historical guy at the core of this. They'll tell you that not finding evidence for a nomad is totally expected, and those anachronisms, just later scribes updating the text to be more understandable. And then right in the middle, you have, well, the middle position. They kind of split the difference, suggesting there might be a cultural memory of a real ancestor, but the stories have been edited so heavily that we'll probably never know the actual historical details.
You know, this whole debate brings us to a different and maybe even more important question. Instead of just asking if Abraham was a real person, what if we ask why his story became so powerful? What purpose did it actually serve?
And this is where this idea of cultural memory becomes super important. It's the theory that communities retell stories about their past not just to record history, but to shape their own identity in the present. A lot of scholars believe the Abraham story was crafted to give hope and a sense of purpose to the people of ancient Israel, especially when they were going through really tough times like being in exile.
So in the end, while we can't confirm a specific historical person, the idea of Abraham became this incredibly powerful symbol, a figure who leaves everything he knows based on a promise from God, who stays faithful even when things look impossible. He was the perfect model for how to keep your identity and your faith even when facing huge challenges. And what's really amazing is how this figure just kept evolving. He wasn't static. For Judaism, he's the father of the covenant. Then Christianity comes along and reinterprets him as the father of faith itself,
making his spiritual family all believers. And in Islam, Ibrahim is this great prophet who rejects idols and submits completely to God, becoming a model for all of humanity.
Paul's use of this verse in the New Testament was an absolute game-changer. He argued that Abraham's righteousness came from his faith long before he followed any specific religious laws. And this blew the doors wide open for him to be seen as the spiritual father of anyone who believes, not just his physical descendants.
And the Qur'an gives Abraham one of the highest honors you can get, calling him a friend of God. In Islam, he represents that original, pure act of submission to the one true God. He's a pure monotheist, a father of prophets, and a role model for every single Muslim.
So where does that leave us? It's kind of a mind-bender, isn't it? We started out searching for a man in history, but what we found instead is this figure whose power seems to go way beyond mere history. So whether he was a real individual, a collective memory, or a literary symbol, the story of Abraham has undeniably shaped civilizations. And that leaves us with one final big question. In the grand scheme of things, what actually matters more? The verifiable historical fact, or the enduring memory that gives meaning and purpose to billions of people?
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the place that takes those huge stacks of research, all the dense academic papers, and, well, we try to boil it all down for you into something clear, something fascinating.
And today we're tackling a really big one, a figure who looms incredibly large in global history and faith, Abraham.
Yeah, Abraham, or Abram as he's first called. I mean, billions of people across Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions look back to him. He's foundational.
Absolutely. In Judaism, he's the father of the covenant. For Christians, he's, this key example of faith. And in Islam, he's Ibrahim, a major prophet, the friend of God. His story in Genesis chapters 11 to 25, it's just monumental.
It really is. But that massive influence, that centrality, it bumps right up against a pretty stark finding from the source material itself, doesn't it?
It does. And that's the core contract we really need to unpack for you today. Despite how absolutely central he is, there's simply no independent extra-biblical evidence confirming he was a real historical person.
Nothing. No inscriptions, no letters, no mention in other ancient records.
Not a single unambiguous piece. Zero direct confirmation from outside the Bible. And that silence is, well, it's pretty significant for historians.
Okay. So that's our mission for this deep dive, right? To take the Genesis stories and really examine them using all the tools we have now, critical scholarship, archaeology, looking closely at the text itself, how the story changed over time.
Exactly. We want to figure out what the sources can actually tell us. Was Abraham a historical person we can somehow recover? Or maybe more like an ancestral memory, a story passed down and shaped over generations?
Or the third option, was he essentially a literary creation?
Yeah.
Someone invented later for specific reasons.
Precisely. And to help you navigate this, we'll basically be looking at three main camps, three ways scholars interpret the evidence. There's the maximalist view. They argue for a real historical core.
Okay.
Then the minimalist view, they see him mostly as a literary invention, probably from around the time of the Babylonian exile or after.
Right. The skeptical end.
And then there's a middle ground, sometimes called the memory core thesis. This view kind of accepts there's a lot of literary shaping, a lot of editing, but maybe, just maybe, there's a nugget of remembered tradition and ancestral memory underneath it all.
Got it. So, three perspectives to weigh the evidence against. And where do we even start trying to find Abraham, but not out in the desert, you're saying?
No, I think the best place to start is with the paper trail, the texts themselves. Before we look for the man, let's look at the story and when it was actually written down.
Okay, so let's unpack this. The stories about Abraham in Genesis, they seem to be set way back, right? Early second millennium BCE. Right. Like 2000, 1800 BCE, that kind of time frame.
That's the traditional setting, yes. The Middle Bronze Age, that's when the patriarchs are usually placed.
But, and this is the crucial bit, the actual physical evidence for the text, the scrolls and manuscripts we have, they're much, much later.
Dramatically later. And this time gap, this huge gulf of maybe 1,500 years or more between the supposed events and our earliest solid copies, well, that's the first major hurdle you have to grapple with.
It kind of undermines the idea that we're reading a direct account from his time.
It makes it very difficult, yes. Take the main Hebrew text. Most modern Bibles rely on the Masoretic text, the MT. It's incredibly detailed, preserved meticulously by Jewish scribes.
Right.
But the earliest really substantial manuscripts we have of the MT, like the big famous codices, Aleppo, Leningrad, they date from the medieval period. We're talking the 9th, 10th centuries AD.
Wow, AD, so nearly 3,000 years after Abraham supposedly lived.
Exactly. That's a massive transmission history. Now, things got a lot more interesting, of course, with the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yes, the big game changer in the 20th century. They pushed the date back considerably, didn't they?
They did, significantly. We found fragments of Genesis among the scrolls, and some of these date back to the 3rd, 2nd, even 1st centuries BCE, like a scroll labeled 4Q Genesis G, for instance.
So that's huge. That gets us much closer to, well, not Abraham's time, but the period when the text was solidifying.
It confirms the text was being copied carefully and was, relatively stable during the late Second Temple period before the time of Jesus. That was a major confirmation of the MT tradition's antiquity, in a relative sense.
But what didn't they find? You hear people talk about the scrolls like they found the original Bible or something.
Right, and that's a key misunderstanding you often encounter. The scrolls are invaluable, but they didn't contain some pristine original version free from any editing. And crucially, for our topic today, they didn't suddenly reveal lost historical facts about Abraham. They show us the text being transmitted reliably in that later period, but not its ultimate origin.
Okay. So the scrolls push the Hebrew text back to maybe 200 BCE. Can we get any earlier evidence of this story being fixed?
We can, actually. By looking at translations, the Septuagint, the LXX, is really important here.
That's the ancient Greek translation.
Yes. Tradition says the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, including Genesis, was translated into Greek in Alexandria, Egypt, probably around 250 BCE.
Why is a translation so significant?
Because you generally don't translate a text, especially a sacred one, into another language for a whole community, unless that text is considered basically finished, settled, and authoritative. The very act of translating the Torah around 250 BCE strongly implies that a complete, recognized version already existed by then. It wasn't just a loose collection of stories anymore.
It had become the Torah.
Exactly. Canonized, at least in the form of those 5 books.
And just to add another layer of complexity, the sources also mention the Samaritan Pentateuch, right? Showing things weren't maybe completely uniform.
That's a great point. The Samaritan Pentateuch is a version of the first 5 books preserved by the Samaritan community. It probably emerged as a distinct textual tradition around the 1st century BCE or CE. It has differences from the Masoretic text and the Septuagint.
So different communities had slightly different versions.
Yes, based on earlier textual streams. It reminds us that the text wasn't monolithic. There was diversity, local editing, different choices being made, even after a sort of mainstream version existed.
Yeah.
It underlines that we're dealing with a text shaped by human hands over a long time.
Okay, so let's pull this thread together. We have medieval Hebrew texts, Dead Sea Scrolls back to maybe the 2nd or 3rd century BCE, a Greek translation around 250 BCE pointing to a fixed Torah by then. What's the bottom line from critical scholarship? When was the story finally put together in the form we basically have it now?
The overwhelming consensus among critical scholars today points to a relatively late date for the final compilation and editing of the Pentateuch, including the Abraham stories.
How late are we talking?
We're likely talking about the Persian period, roughly 450 down to maybe 350 BCE. Some might push it slightly into the early Hellenistic period, but that post-exilic timeframe after the return from Babylon is key.
Wow. So the stories are set way back around 2000 BCE, but they're being finalized, edited, woven together almost 1,500 years later by people living under Persian rule.
Exactly. And you have to ask yourself, why then? These editors, living in the small province of Yehud, part of the Persian Empire, they weren't just antiquarians preserving old tales. They were grappling with huge questions.
Like, who are we now after the kingdom is gone?
Precisely. Who are we? Who belongs in this community? What's our claim to this land? How do we relate to God without a king? Maybe even sometimes without a temple fully functioning as before.
And the Abraham story becomes a way to answer those questions.
It becomes a foundational narrative. By shaping the story of this ancient ancestor, they could define their identity, legitimize their presence in the land through divine promise, and articulate their unique relationship with God. The story functions for them, for the needs of that post-exilic community.
Okay, that's a really crucial frame. The text tells us as much or maybe more about the time it was written as the time it's set in.
That's the perspective critical scholarship brings, and it sets us up perfectly to look at the content of the stories themselves, particularly the parts that just don't seem to fit that ancient setting, the archaeology and the anachronisms.
All right, so we've established the text was likely finalized much later, around the Persian period. Now let's look inside the story. Does anything in the narrative actually match the supposed setting back in the Middle Bronze Age around 2000 BCE? Are there any, plausible cultural details?
There are a few things that scholars, especially earlier ones, pointed to. We have to be careful, though. For example, the names Abram, Sarai.
What about them?
Well, the study of names, onomastics, shows that these are typical West Semitic name types. You find names with similar components, similar linguistic structures in texts from the 2nd millennium BCE, from places like Mari on the Euphrates or Alak in Syria.
Okay, so the names sound right for the period. That seems like a point in favor of authenticity.
It's suggestive, yes. It shows the writers perhaps knew or used names that fit the general linguistic background. But the problem is these name types were common for a very long time and over a wide area.
So finding similar names doesn't prove this specific Abram existed then.
Exactly. It's plausible, but it's not diagnostic. It doesn't pinpoint anything. And what's maybe more revealing is how the name gets changed later in the story. Abram becomes Abraham.
Right. Genesis 17, God changes his name.
And the text explicitly tells us why. Father of many nations. The name Abram might have originally meant something like, the father is exalted, or possibly even linked to a specific deity, Ram. The god Ram is father. But the text reinterprets it theologically.
To give it a universal meaning.
Precisely. Father of many nations fits perfectly with the theological agenda of the post-exilic editors who needed to define a broad, inclusive identity based on divine promise, not just narrow tribal lineage. They reshaped the name to fit the message.
That's subtle but significant. It shows the theological purpose overriding maybe an older meaning.
It suggests the final authors were more interested in the theological meaning for their time than just preserving an ancient name accurately.
Now, what about those customs? I remember hearing about how scholars in the mid-20th century used things like the Nutsi tablets to prove Genesis was historically accurate. Things like Abraham adopting his servant Eliezer, or Sarah giving Hagar to Abraham.
Ah, yes, the Nutsi parallels. That was a huge wave in scholarship, particularly associated with figures like E.A. Spicer or Cyrus Gordon. For a time, it seemed like archaeology had confirmed the patriarchal narratives. They pointed to legal texts from Nutsi, a site in Mesopotamia dated around the 15th century BCE, and claimed they illuminated these specific customs in Genesis.
So what happened to that argument? You don't hear it as much now.
Well, further research, particularly by scholars like Thomas Thompson and John Van Seters, and later refinements by others, really dismantled those parallels. The source material is pretty clear now. Those connections were often based on misunderstandings or were just too general.
How so? What was wrong with the parallels?
Several things. Sometimes the Nutsi texts were misinterpreted. Other times, the supposed custom in Genesis wasn't actually that unique to the 2nd millennium. Things like surrogate motherhood existed in various forms across the ancient Near East for a long time. And in some cases, the specific legal details just didn't match up properly between Nutsi and Genesis.
So it was a case of maybe wanting to find connections too eagerly.
Perhaps. It was an attempt to anchor Genesis historically, but the anchors didn't really hold up under closer scrutiny. Most critical scholars today don't rely on those Nutsi or Mari parallels to date the patriarchal stories anymore.
Okay, so the names are suggestive but not proof. The customs parallels have largely faded. What about the things that actively seem wrong for the period? The definite anachronisms.
Now we get to the really strong evidence for late composition. These are the elements in the story that simply could not have existed in 2000 BCE. The classic example is the camel.
Right. Abraham seems to have lots of camels. They're mentioned as transport, as wealth.
They are. Genesis uses them quite routinely. But here's the problem. Archaeology, specifically archaeozoology, the study of ancient animal bones combined with radiocarbon dating, tells a very different story.
What do they tell us?
It shows that while camels existed, the widespread domestication of the dromedary camel as a common pack animal in the southern Levant, the area where these stories are set didn't really happen until the late 10th century BCE or even later.
Late 10th century, so like King David's time or Solomon's time?
Around then, yes. Maybe starting a bit before, but becoming common much later. That's 1,000 years, give or take, after Abraham's supposed time.
So having Abraham travel around with caravans of camels in 2000 BCE is impossible.
It's highly anachronistic. It strongly suggests the writers were projecting the reality of their own time, the Iron Age, when camels were common beasts of burden back onto the patriarchal past. They wrote what they knew.
That's a pretty big one. What else?
Another classic is the location mentioned as Abraham's birthplace, Ur of the Chaldeans.
Ur, the famous city in Mesopotamia. What's wrong with that?
itself existed way back, of course, but the qualifier of the Chaldeans is the problem.
Why? Who were the Chaldeans?
The Chaldeans were originally Aramean tribes who migrated into southern Mesopotamia, the region around much later. They start appearing in Assyrian records maybe in the 9th century BCE, and they only rose to real prominence when they established the Neo-Babylonian Empire in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE. Think Nebuchadnezzar.
So in 2000 BCE, wasn't known as being of the Chaldeans.
Absolutely not. That term only makes sense from the perspective of someone living much later, probably during or after the Babylonian exile, when Babylonia was known as the land of the Chaldeans.
So it's like an editor adding a clarifying note for later readers, but accidentally revealing when they lived?
Exactly. It's what we call an editorial gloss. It's meant to help the reader locate but it uses terminology that betrays the later date of the writer or editor.
Okay, camels, Chaldeans, anymore.
The Philistines, Genesis 21 and 26, have stories where Abraham, and later his son Isaac, interact with Philistines, including a king named Abimelech in Gerar.
And the Philistines weren't around yet either.
Not in the way Genesis describes them, settled in cities with kings on the coastal plain. Archaeologically, the Philistines are identified as one group among the Sea Peoples who migrated to the Levant and settled areas like Gaza, Ashdod, Ekron, starting around the 12th century BCE.
Again, centuries after Abraham's time.
Hundreds of years later. So mentioning Philistines in the patriarchal narratives is another clear anachronism pointing to a first millennium BCE composition or editing process.
This is quite a list. Camels, Chaldeans, Philistines, all pointing away from the Middle Bronze Age and towards the Iron Age or later.
It's cumulative, and it makes it very hard to sustain the idea that the text is a straightforward historical account from the second millennium.
What about the big events, like that battle in Genesis 14? 4 kings against 5, Abraham leads a rescue mission. Sounds like history.
Genesis 14 is a fascinating chapter. It's got this international scope, lists all these kings and places. But the problem is, despite intensive searching, historians and archaeologists haven't found any independent confirmation of this specific war or these specific kings in any other ancient Near Eastern records.
None of the names match known rulers.
Not convincingly. There have been attempts to link them, but nothing solid holds up. Most scholars view Genesis 14 as a literary composition, possibly added later to the Genesis narrative, designed to portray Abraham as a powerful, heroic figure on a grand stage. It reads more like epic literature than historical reporting.
And finally, just basic archaeology at the places Abraham supposedly visited. Hebron, Bethel, Shechem.
Excavations have happened at many of these key sites, of course, and they show occupation during various periods, including the Middle Bronze Age in some cases. But there's absolutely no specific archaeological trace connected to Abraham himself. No altar inscription saying Abraham was here, no unique structure linked to the stories.
Just the general background noise of settlement.
Exactly. The specific patriarchal narrative finds no direct echo in the ground, so the silence of archaeology aligns with the anachronisms in the text.
Okay, so the textual evidence points late. The internal evidence has major chronological problems. This really sets the stage for the different scholarly interpretations, doesn't it? How do people make sense of all this? Right, so given everything we've just laid out, the late manuscripts, the camels, the Chaldeans, the lack of external proof, scholars are divided on what to make of Abraham. Let's map out those main positions you mentioned earlier, starting with the most skeptical end. The minimalists.
The minimalist school, or sometimes called the Copenhagen School because of scholars associated with the university there like Thomas L. Thompson and Niels Peter Lemech, alongside others like John Van Seters, they take the evidence we've discussed very seriously.
And conclude.
They conclude that Abraham is essentially a literary figure, an invention, created most likely during the Babylonian exile, or more probably in the post-exilic period, the Persian era.
So not based on a real person at all.
Not in any recoverable way, no. Their argument rests squarely on the lack of any contemporary evidence for him, combined with the strong positive evidence for late composition, namely all those anachronisms.
The camels and Chaldeans basically proved the story was written late, in their view.
Yes, and they add another layer, the theology. They argue that the sophisticated, almost monotheistic portrayal of Abraham, and especially the detailed focus on the promise of land, reflects the specific concerns and the developed religious thought of the Judean community after the exile, struggling to redefine itself in the Persian period.
So the story perfectly fits the needs of 400 BCE, not 2000 BCE.
That's the core of the minimalist argument. It's a foundational myth. an origin story crafted for later political and religious purposes. An imaginative construction, not history remembered.
Okay, that's a clear, if stark, position. Now what about the other extreme? The maximalists. How do they possibly defend a historical Abraham against all that evidence?
Well, the maximalist position, often associated with more conservative scholarship or figures from an earlier generation like W.F. Albright or Kenneth Kitchen more recently, starts from a different premise. They often begin with the assumption that the text is generally reliable unless proven otherwise.
So they try to find ways to make the evidence fit a historical core.
Essentially, yes. They argue for a real tribal leader named Abraham back in the second millennium. They emphasize the points we mentioned earlier, the West Semitic names, the supposed cultural parallels, though those are weaker now. They argue these do broadly fit the alleged time period.
But what do they do with the killer anachronisms? Camels, the Chaldeans. You can't just ignore them.
Their main strategy is to downplay them. They argue these are just minor later additions, scribal glosses, or updates.
Explain glosses again.
Like a little explanatory note added by a later scribe. So they might say, okay, the original story didn't mention camels. Maybe Abraham used donkeys. A later scribe familiar with camels just updated the text. Or the original text just said and a later scribe added of the Chaldeans to help readers locate it.
So they're saying these errors don't invalidate the whole story, just show minor later tampering.
That's the argument. They try to peel back these later layers to reveal an authentic historical core, and for the lack of direct archaeological evidence for Abraham.
What's the explanation there?
They often point to the narrative itself. Abraham was a semi-nomad. Nomads, they argue, don't typically build monumental cities or leave inscriptions. They travel light. So the lack of evidence is actually what you'd expect if the story were true.
That sounds a bit like using the absence of evidence as evidence itself.
That's the criticism often leveled against it. The maximalist approach relies heavily on arguing from the text outward and explaining away contradictory data. While it holds appeal for those wanting historical confirmation, the sheer weight of the anachronisms and the lack of any positive external evidence makes it a difficult position to maintain within mainstream critical scholarship today.
Okay, so minimalists say no history, maximalists say yes history, just ignore the problems. That leaves the middle ground, the memory core thesis. Where does that land?
This is where I think it's fair to say a large number of Creole scholars find themselves now. It's a more nuanced position associated with people like William Dever or Baruch Halpern, though many others contribute. It fully accepts the findings about late composition. Yes, the text was finalized in the Persian period. Yes, it's full of anachronisms. Yes, it serves later theological agendas. But it doesn't necessarily jump to the conclusion that the figure of Abraham was entirely invented out of whole cloth. It holds open the possibility that the late editors were working with older materials, with fragments of ancestral traditions, folk memories perhaps, about a founding figure or figures.
So maybe there was an Abraham or an Abram whose memory persisted, even if vaguely?
Possibly. Or perhaps Abraham became a composite figure, embodying memories of different tribal ancestors. The key idea is memory. We can't recover the historical individual, the evidence just isn't there. But the narrative might preserve echoes of the past, filtered through centuries of storytelling and theological reflection.
How does this idea of cultural memory work? You mentioned that earlier.
Scholars drawing on memory studies look at how communities use stories about the past to shape their identity in the present. For the struggling Judean community in Persian period Yuhud, the Abraham story became a powerful site of cultural memory.
A place to define themselves.
Exactly. Think about what the story offered them. An ancestor who came from outside Canaan, respectable origins, not like the locals they sometimes clashed with. An ancestor who was fiercely loyal to God, establishing their unique religious identity. And crucially, an ancestor who was promised this specific land by God himself long before kings or temples.
That's a powerful claim when you're living under foreign rule and maybe neighbors are questioning your right to be there.
It's the ultimate legitimation. The Abraham narrative, shaped in the Persian period, functioned to consolidate the community, define its boundaries, justify its land claims, and articulate its core theology. It's a brilliant piece of identity construction using remembered, or perhaps constructed, ancestral traditions.
So the memory core view accepts the late editing and the theological shaping, but allows for some kind of older tradition, however faint or transformed, underneath it all.
Correct. It acknowledges the profound literary and theological creativity of the final editors, while leaving the door slightly ajar for some connection, however tenuous, to older ancestral memories. It seems to best balance the textual evidence, the archaeological silence, and the clear function of the narrative for its later audience.
So if the historical Abraham is basically lost to us, buried under layers of editing and memory, what's really fascinating is what happened next. How the figure, once solidified in the text, took on a life of its own.
Absolutely. The story didn't just stop evolving once the Torah was compiled. Every major community that inherited the Abraham narrative started to reinterpret and reshape him to fit their own needs, their own theological developments. He became this infinitely adaptable icon.
Let's trace that. Starting within Judaism, after the main biblical text was more or less set. How did they continue to develop the Abraham story?
We see it happening already in the Second Temple period. Take the Book of Jubilees, written probably in the 2nd century BCE. It retells Genesis, but adds a lot.
What kind of things does Jubilees add?
It's very focused on law observance. Jubilees portrays Abraham as meticulously following laws that, according to the main Torah narrative, weren't even given until Moses at Sinai hundreds of years later. He keeps the Sabbath, celebrates festivals, follows specific purity rules.
So it's retroactively making Abraham into a perfect Torah-observant Jew.
Precisely. In a time of Hellenistic pressure, when Jewish identity was strongly tied to adherence to the law, Jubilees reimagines the Founding Father as the ultimate role model of that adherence. It also strongly emphasizes him as the first true monotheist battling paganism.
And this trend continues in the later rabbinic writings, the Midrash.
Oh, absolutely. The rabbis really fleshed out his biography with legendary material. This is where you get the famous stories not found in Genesis at all of Abraham as a young boy smashing his father Terah's idols.
The idol shop story, right?
Yes, and his debates with the wicked king Nimrod, being thrown into a fiery furnace for his faith and miraculously surviving.
Again, none of that's in the original Genesis account. What's the point of adding these dramatic stories?
The Midrash uses these stories to make Abraham the embodiment of key rabbinic values. Rejecting idolatry, intellectual courage in defending monotheism, radical hospitality, another big theme in rabbinic Abraham stories, and unwavering faith even in persecution. He becomes the ideal rabbi, in a sense, projected back into the past.
Yeah. So each Jewish era reshaped him slightly to be the ancestor they needed. Makes sense. Now, what happens when the story moves into Christianity? Paul, in the New Testament, seems to do something pretty radical with Abraham.
Paul's use of Abraham, especially in his letters to the Romans and Galatians, is absolutely pivotal. It's a theological masterstroke, really. He's grappling with the huge question of how Gentiles, non-Jews, fit into God's plan of salvation through Jesus Christ.
And he uses Abraham to solve this. How?
He zooms in on one specific verse in Genesis chapter 15, verse 6. Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness.
Okay. What's so special about that verse for Paul?
Paul points out the timing. This declaration of Abraham's righteousness happens before Abraham is circumcised. That's in Genesis 17, and obviously long before the law of Moses was given.
So faith came first, before the works of the law, before the physical sign of the covenant.
Exactly. Paul argues that Abraham was justified, made right with God, through his faith, his belief alone. Therefore, Paul concludes, Abraham is the father not just of the circumcised, the Jews, but of all who believe, whether Jew or Gentile.
Wow. That completely reframes Abraham. He goes from being the physical ancestor of one people to the spiritual father of a universal faith community.
It's a radical repurposing. Paul detaches Abraham's primary significance from ethnic lineage and law observance and ties it directly to faith in God's promise, which Paul sees fulfilled in Christ. This makes Abraham the prototype for Christian salvation by grace through faith.
And other parts of the New Testament build on this, like the book of Hebrews.
Hebrews also uses Abraham extensively, but maybe with a slightly different emphasis. It presents him as the supreme example of faith demonstrated through obedience, particularly highlighting his willingness to sacrifice Isaac.
Reading that story as foreshadowing God's sacrifice of Jesus.
Yes, that's a common Christian interpretation, seeing Isaac as a type of Christ. Hebrews uses Abraham's whole life journey, leaving his home, living as a nomad, offering Isaac as a model of enduring faith and hope in God's unseen promises, encouraging Christians facing hardship.
So within Christianity, he becomes this key figure demonstrating justification by faith and obedient faithfulness. Now, let's turn to Islam. He's incredibly important there too, as Ibrahim.
Hugely important. Ibrahim is one of the most revered prophets in Islam, considered a pure, primordial monotheist who existed before Judaism or Christianity. He's given the title Khalil Allah, the friend of God.
Does the Quran retell the Genesis stories, or does it have different accounts?
It includes some familiar elements, like his rejection of idolatry. The Quran also has narratives of him confronting his people's idols, similar in theme to the Midrashic stories, and being saved from fire. But it also introduces distinct narratives and emphasis.
Such as his connection to Mecca?
That's central. The Quran describes Ibrahim and his son, Ishmael, built or rebuilding the Kaaba in Mecca, establishing it as a center of pure monotheistic worship.
And in Islamic tradition, it's Ishmael, not Isaac, who was the son Abraham was willing to sacrifice.
Yes, that's the dominant Islamic understanding. While the Quran doesn't explicitly name the son in the sacrifice story, tradition strongly identifies him as Ishmael.
What's the significance of focusing on Ishmael and Mecca?
It firmly roots the origins of Islam and its central shrine, the Kaaba, in the actions of this primordial prophet, Ibrahim. It establishes an independent Arabian trajectory for monotheism, linked directly back to Abraham, positioning Islam not as a deviation from Judaism or Christianity, but as the restoration of Abraham's original pure faith Islam, meaning submission to God.
So Ibrahim becomes the model of submission, the founder of Mecca's holiness, and the direct ancestor, through Ishmael, of the Arabs, and ultimately the Prophet Muhammad.
Exactly. His function within Islam is to be that pure, universal monotheist who stands at the headwaters of the tradition, validating its core tenets and practices.
It's really quite incredible. The same core figure, Ibrahim, serving as a foundational cornerstone for three distinct global religions, yet subtly, or not so subtly, reshaped by each to authorize their own specific claims and identity.
It really underscores that his power, historically speaking, lies less in the unrecoverable facts of his life and more in the enduring resonance and adaptability of his story. He became a mirror reflecting the needs and beliefs of each community that looked to him. #tag conclusion and final thought.
Okay, so let's try and synthesize this deep dive. We started with Abraham, this colossal figure revered by billions, but we quickly ran into the fact that the historical trail runs cold.
Completely cold, yeah. No direct evidence from his supposed time, around 2000 BCE. What we do have is a text, the Genesis narrative, that shows clear signs of being finalized much, much later, probably around 450 to 350 BCE in the Persian period.
And that late text is filled with clues pointing to its time of writing the anachronisms. Camels being used commonly, the mention of the Chaldeans, the presence of Philistines, things that just don't fit the supposed Bronze Age setting.
Right. Those elements strongly suggest Iron Age or later authors projecting their own world back onto the past. The cultural links, like the names, are plausible, but too generic to prove anything specific. Archaeology at the key sites is silent about him.
So, putting it all together, where does that leave us on the historical question?
I think the evidence strongly points away from being able to recover Abraham as a verifiable historical individual. The maximalist hope of finding a real second millennium chieftain seems largely unsupported by the critical data.
And the minimalist view that he's purely a literary invention of the post-exilic period has strong arguments based on the anachronisms and the theological function.
It does, but perhaps the most balanced view, the one that seems to fit the evidence best, is that memory core thesis.
Which says?
It says we should take the late composition and theological shaping seriously. The Abraham story, as we have it, is undoubtedly a literary product of the Persian period designed to meet the needs of that community. However, it might be built upon older, perhaps hazy, ancestral traditions or folk memories. We can't prove it, but it leaves room for some continuity of memory, however transformed.
So he's best understood not as history, but as a figure of powerful collective memory and theological imagination, shaped and reshaped over centuries.
I think that's the fairest assessment of the evidence. The story tells us a huge amount about the people who told it, who wrote it down, who reinterpreted it, about their struggles, their hopes, their identity.
Which brings us to our final thought for you, the listener. We've seen how ancient communities, Judeans, Christians, Muslims, took this foundational figure, Abraham or Ibrahim, and consistently reframed his story to address their own contemporary crises. Questions of identity, land rights, the nature of faith, community boundaries. They needed him to be certain things. So they remembered and retold his story that way.
So the question to leave you with is this: how does the way we, today, choose to remember and retell the stories of our own founding figures, whether they're national heroes, cultural icons, religious pioneers, how does that reflect our current needs? What anxieties, what aspirations, what political projects are revealed in the way we selectively remember, emphasize, or even ignore poets of their stories in the 21st century?
Are we still shaping our ancestors to fit our present? Something to think about.